Hello, this is Rev Brad, and you're listening to the Soccer Chaplains United podcast from the Touchline. This is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we've been talking about how faith helps one's mental health. Well, today I'm pleased to have special guest with us, Brooke Ewert. Brooke is the founder and director of the Rocky Mountain Sports Counseling Center. She's a sports counselor, and she and I worked together for a number of years when Soccer Chaplains United had counselors incorporated into our teams. We're still great friends. She's part of our referral network for athletes and those that need sports counseling. So I've broken the interview into two parts, and just after this, we get started with part one.
He's found the space, and he's found the back of the net.
Just a little off foot, thinking he's going to go far post. Not strong enough with his right hand.
Whips that one in. Far post, almost made him ends, and they have. He has the hat-trick. The second in his career. The third of the night. The hat-trick hero.
Talked about you're not going to be able to sustain that kind of pressure.
To the corner. Goes towards the near post. And you're the angle, and what a goal! What a goal!
Brooke, welcome to the podcast today. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much, Brad. I'm excited to be here with you.
Yeah, it's been a little while since last time we were together and shared, but it's good to connect with you during this Mental Health Awareness Month of May. But Brooke, maybe for the listener that doesn't know you, or just share a little bit of your background, your bio with us. Where'd you grow up? What does life look like right now? Just share with us some of those things.
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in Southern California and lived there until I was 17. I grew up in a little town called Yorba Linda, California, which is just a little bit to the east of Anaheim where Disney is. Went to college at Oregon State University where I met my husband. I was a psych major. My first year, or actually I was a pre-med major my first year. I should go back a little bit and quickly realize that taking bio classes and chem classes for the next 3 or 4 years did not sound super appealing. And I started thinking about what do I actually want to do? What am I really interested in? And sport was always such a big fascination to me, even in high school, just what made athletes different from one another? Why was one person significantly better than someone else? What were they doing? Did genetics play into that? And so it was always a little bit in the back of my mind.
Brooke, what sports did you play in high school?
So this is probably weird to say to an athlete of the year 2024. I played, I think 6 or 7 sports prior to when I finished my career in high school, but predominantly this is weird. I'm 6 feet tall. So I was a gymnast. I was not 6 feet tall when I was a gymnast. I was very short until probably my sophomore year and had a massive growth spurt, which we've also seen with one of our kids, which is super interesting. Then was what am I going to do? And I loved high jumping and had done that since I was really young. So I went to high jump and then played basketball, kind of got recruited to play basketball. It was not my favorite, was not super great at it. I think a little bit of it was just not a lot of meat on the bones at that point. So getting pushed around a lot. So I did those 2 sports, but I had played tennis and volleyball. I had done dance. I had really honestly, I think I did softball in high school or in middle school. So I had really done a lot of sport, which was really kind of an interesting thing that leads into what I do today as a sports counselor, because when athletes ask me, do you understand my sport? For the most part, I actually do understand majority of the sports, because I kind of had my hand in a lot of the sports that I see. So when I was at Oregon State, going back to that piece of the story, I stumbled upon a class called sports psychology, and it was taught by a woman. And so I always kind of have to stop and pause there just a little bit, because at the time in the 90s, there were not a lot of women in sports. Yeah. There weren't reporters. I mean, it was probably just on the verge of breaking into that. And no women coaching, unless it was a women's sport, and maybe even not even there as much yet either. So it was pretty male dominated. And this woman, her name was Dr. Ebbets. I think her name is Vicki Ebbets, was so instrumental in what changed the trajectory of what I do and why I became what I do. And I was she is a woman and she's involved in sports, and she is from Australia. And at the time, I didn't realize that Australia was way ahead of where we are with sports and counseling and psychology. And so it was super fascinating to listen to her talk And she would like have us go into, we did labs and like we learned how to do breathing techniques and all these like super interesting things that we would use with athletes. And I was like completely hooked from that day on. Like I was like, this is super fascinating. Like I could work with athletes. The interesting thing about that time, and I think if I had gone straight through from like college into grad school and then tried to do what I do today, I'm not sure it would have worked. I definitely feel like there was like a hold or a pause for a reason because I don't think the stigma of like going to see someone was quite down yet. It's a lot better now.
Sure.
But at the time, it was significantly like there was the wall, like no one was going to talk to anybody. Maybe if you were lucky, there were, you know, a few here and there dotted throughout the country of people who were working with athletes on the mental health side, but probably not as much yet. And so I felt like in some ways, I feel like God kind of put a pause there and was like, you're going to get there, but not yet. And then my husband and I got married, had 4 kids, got to watch all 4 of our kids go through sport, which is really interesting dynamic about like also with what I do today is that I see it from a parent side as well. And we raised all 4 of our kids. Our last one is graduating. This week is done with, so all 4 of our kids are through school.
Wow. Congratulations.
I know we're there. We're at the empty nest phase, which is kind of a weird thing to say. I was thinking this morning, I think next year will be the first time that we don't have someone in school in like over 20 years, which feels very weird to say. With having 4 kids, like, you know, 2 years apart, it just, you know, succinctively, we've had someone in school for so long. But another part of our story is that our second daughter, Delaney, is a professional ballerina, which adds a whole nother dynamic to our family, which is, you know, there's a lot of things that go into being a professional athlete, which we'll get into, but there's some really interesting things that I see from her side, but also like that I see in my clients as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you just mentioning the professional ballet reminds me of one of the early soccer coaches that used to work with the Rapids, Glenn Mooch-Meyernick, and one of his daughters was is a principal. Is that the correct term?
Yes.
He was a principal, I think, for the Houston Ballet, and so really was really gifted and opened my eyes to like a whole new level of professional elite sport, elite athlete kind of thing. I mean, I grew up thinking, well, dancers are just dancers, right? Like it didn't compute that the physical demands that are on their role, and so share with us maybe a little bit, if you don't mind, how did Delaney get into sort of the professional ballet scene? Was that, I mean, you guys were here in Colorado, correct? I don't know, is Colorado a big professional ballet, pool comes out of Colorado? How'd that happen?
That's such a good question. I don't know if I've ever been asked that before. I would not say Colorado is a hotbed, but I do know a lot of girls who have come out of here. I just would say probably more of the hotbeds are probably Houston or New York, you know, or, you know, maybe California, where there's probably a lot, maybe even, I'm even thinking Florida too, where there's some pretty good studios. But she, at the age of 10, decided she wanted to leave competition dance and went to a ballet studio here in Colorado for, boy, probably 5 years, I'm thinking. And at that year, I would say she definitely started to struggle a little bit with her mental health and just anxiety and like pressures and expectations. And like she started to put a lot of it on herself. Then also, you know, like maybe not getting the roles that she was ready for yet, or, you know, physically wasn't ready to do. And then starting to feel like, where is this going for me at this studio? And she actually took some time off, actually, just to like kind of take care of herself, I think. And then pursued her ballet career. I would honestly say started from there, like towards the professional ranks. I always try to equate it to baseball and like single A, double A, triple A. Like that's probably the best way. And she started off in like a professional development program at Nashville Ballet, and then went to Sarasota Ballet and moved up to the trainees, which is like kind of like double A. And then, you know, was there for a few years during COVID, which was actually kind of a blessing in disguise because Florida brought their ballet dancers back pretty quickly because of the COVID.
Sure.
Were very light there comparatively. And then went to a company in New Jersey called American Repertory Ballet, which then, for another few years and just grinding. I mean, ballet is just all about the grind. And I honestly think those who sometimes have extreme talent in the beginning don't actually feel the grittiness and the grind that it is, because they just maybe sometimes have that talent. And she had to work so hard. And last year she was awarded a studio company position within her ballet company in California at San Jose Ballet, or what's called New Ballet of San Jose. And then this year was awarded a full contract for a full ballet. Like, she's now a full-fledged company member, which is such an interesting journey. I mean, that's 6 years, and that sounds like, oh, 6 years isn't that much, but that's a lot in the ballet, like in ballet world, like just to have that constant, I'm on a struggle. I'm struggling through this. I'm struggling. It's like, it's very mentally draining. But I think, sometimes like I look at her and I tell people this all the time. She's the grittiest athlete I've ever met. Like, she's just, if someone says, no, you can't do it, she's like, I'll figure out a way to do it. And so I think there's some traits you see in athletes that you're like, yeah, like these are why some people make, go from maybe not as talented to the top, because they really do have something internal within them that just won't stop and won't quit.
Brooke, you saying that reminds me that typically elite athletes have a very short career span, lifespan in terms of that vocational element where they're at the top level. For soccer here in the U.S., I've seen it maybe be 3 to 5 years for an athlete. Some of the other ones that take really good care of themselves tend to go without injury. That can be longer for sure. What is that in professional ballet? Because when you think about those 6 years to get there, and it taking a grind and taking a toll, it's not that you've arrived, because you always have people competing and coming up. So there's always you never arrive. You're usually looking over your shoulder in some ways, and the same is true for football, for soccer. That people are always competing and striving, and people are getting younger and quicker and faster and all those things. So what is that though? What's Delaney looking at in terms of just being at that sort of full company, full contract kind of level?
I mean, my guess is it's probably not that much different in the ballet world. I think the amount of time they spend on their feet, I think it's just honestly so much about injury prevention, probably from here on out too. It's like, just like you said, taking care of yourself, eating right, mentally being in a good place. Like, there's all these factors, and you're right. They're always trying to replace everybody. I mean, that's the goal of any professional sport or, performance group, is that they're looking for who's going to be better than this person. And I don't know if I feel like in some ways in ballet, there's maybe a little bit of loyalty that kind of sets in over time. Like, you've been here, you put in your time, but I don't think there's ever that like, oh, I'm never going to get fired either. So I think, honestly, my guess is it's 3 to 5 years. It's funny, I always tell people Tom Brady was an anomaly. Like, most people don't get to 45. And I would say the same thing happens in ballet. There's a few girls that I can think of that are at the top, at their, like in their waning, twilight of their careers, and they're like in their mid 40s, but that's not common.
So that means we have to talk about the R word, retirement. And it's funny because most of us, most of the majority of first world American Europeans are thinking retirement is something I do when I'm in my late 60s, 70s, maybe earlier if things have gone really well in my business and industry. But we're talking about young people in their 20s and 30s that are faced with, what do I do next? And Brooke, this is part of the work that you do with Rocky Mountain Sports Counseling Center. So maybe share a little bit about, what does the retirement conversation look like? And maybe share with us too about Rocky Mountain Sports Counseling Center, like what are the main sports, the athletes that you guys are working with? Share with us a little bit about the center and the sort of around that retirement conversation and those things.
Yeah. The retirement conversation could be a podcast in itself, because I actually think this is something that actually rarely gets talked about. So I'll kind of save that to the end. So remind me if I get sidetracked to come back there.
Sure.
The Rocky Mountain Sports Counseling Center was created 7.5 years ago, primarily for athletes to work on their mental health, to work through injuries, things that come up during injuries, and then also transitions out of sport retirement. Um, and I think what we've seen as the team has grown over the years, as we continue to see more and more athletes seeking it themselves instead of others, there's still a lot of like bridge work, like someone coming to us and saying like, I really think that this person would benefit from your services. So we do a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy and in our sessions, like working through cognitions, how they connect to behaviors, and then fixing a lot of how those two meld together. And then just being a really safe space for athletes. I feel like athletes really don't have that many places where they can actually be their authentic self because they're kind of always on. And we want those rooms to be places where they can talk through family issues or relationships, or my coach is really on my case right now. I don't know what to do about that. Or I'm really struggling with like, obsessive compulsive thoughts and so the things that we see predominantly are anxiety, depression, panic disorders, OCD, eating disorders, and those tend to kind of be the 5 that are at the very top for athletes. When we see athletes, honestly, I would say we've really started to hone in more with like the elite athlete in high school. That doesn't mean they're all elite, but like pretty good. Like they're going to college, they're going to be like at the next level. Collegiate athletes who are maybe under pressure significantly more than the average, like the D1, D2, D3 athletes who are really good at their sport. Maybe also now talking about transfer portal stuff. This has been a lot of more like new stuff for me in the last few years, is how the transfer portals really opened up a lot. And then I would say at the professional and Olympic level, we just see all the complications of sport and life. And if you're a female, like when do I stop doing sports so I can have kids? And like, what does that look like? Can I come back? And for males, it's like, how long do I stay in my sport? What am I going to do after my sport is over? Which then kind of leads into the, retirement conversation, which is so interesting, like how things work out. This is actually what I feel like I'm focusing in more and more and more now, even starting at the elite high school level. And I asked this very simple question: if I took your sport away from you today, who would you be? And they always have this look of dread. Like, what does that even mean? I don't know who I am without my sport because my life is my sport. But I really firmly believe, and this is kind of where some of my dissertation work is heading to, is if these conversations are started significantly earlier, I think there's significant less anxiety at the end of their career. So even I have like a 36-year-old male athlete right now who, is probably definitely in the twilight of his career. We know just statistically, probably not that much time is left. And we're just starting to talk about like, what are your transferable skills that come from sport that can go into your next career? What are you interested in? What have you learned in sport that you actually like, oh, you know what? I think that I would be really good at this, and even just starting those conversations, I call it the second pathway, meaning you can straddle both of those pathways and still be an athlete. But it doesn't mean you have to have full weight in the second pathway either. You can have just a partial thoughts, like, oh, you know what? I just had this the other day. Like one of my clients was like, you know what, Brooke, I think I want to be an athletic trainer. Then the next week he's like, actually, I think I want to be a firefighter. So it's like I want those thoughts just to start forming. It doesn't mean that they're not going to perform at the highest level of their sport, but they're just thinking about it. And I like now have dropped that question all the way down into the high school level and the collegiate level. And like, what else is out there besides sport? Because we all know that sport cannot last forever. We know that one day it will end. And if you start this process, and interestingly, Brad, the females tend to do significantly better with this right now. And that's kind of where I see the statistics and the research heading, is like, why is that? And I've asked other sports psychologists at other like programs or even college levels, like who, like it just tends to like, they kind of start to have this idea or funnel. And so my goal really is to get the conversation going with the males significantly earlier, because I really do think they have ideas. I think they're just scared that if they like kind of split their mind into two, that means they're not going to be hyper focused on sport. And I actually think you can just have it in the back of your head as a reserve, and like one day, even language like that as well.
That's been my experience is with the male athletes and male soccer players that I work with, is if I give any attention to this other thing that I might enjoy or like or be or identify with, it will detract or take away from the hyper focus, use that word, that I need to stay at this elite level, to be at this elite level, to perform at this elite level. And so there's almost a superstition, we might say, or a stigma or a fear about, if I think about anything else, I will be less than, I will have less mental energy, emotional energy towards this thing that I have to be so focused and stay so fixed on. And that becomes, at least that's been the most common barrier that I've experienced. I think the other one that I've experienced when I speak with athletes about what's next, and that's always a tender subject, because I coach our chaplains. Like, you can't just walk in and go, well, hey, what are you going to be otherwise? What's your identity? Like, you can't. It almost denigrates or it demeans them in a way. It's almost like saying, hey, I think you're finished, or you're close. This injury could mean you're finished. So we have to be careful about when we have those conversations. But I've noticed too that other athletes think, well, it has to be somewhere within the sport. And they really haven't had much experience outside the sport to know other things that, as you said, transferable skills, or what are roles that they could parlay their experience into. They don't really have a lot of experience around those things. That becomes a challenge as well. How do you address some of those?
Yeah, I think part of that is a little bit, as soon as the conversation gets going, it's just like, keep your eyes open for things. Like, are there other things that you're interested in? What are things that you feel like you maybe have had interest in, that you've like, or just even passing conversations with people, you're like, oh, that job sounds kind of interesting. So I think part of it is that. And then I think a little bit of it is career counseling at some point. Like, what would these transferable skills go to? And you kind of give them a list of some jobs. Again, while they're in sport, they don't need to be fully focused there. I think it's just, like I said, something in the back of your mind, keep it there when you retire. And I think when we see they retire with this, well, like, I've kind of started to think about it. I kind of know where my transition point's going to come. This is still going to be hard. It's going to be weird. I don't know what to do with myself. I'm bored. I don't know how to move my body anymore if I'm not doing my sport like I used to. It's always so interesting. It's always like, well, what do I do for working out now? And I'm like, well, that's something you're going to figure out over time. But they all go to, I want to run a marathon. And I'm like, I think the only thing that I can think of that equates to is like, I'm going to be running a lot, and it's going to maybe equal some physicality that I feel in my sport. And I always laugh because it happens, like, it's probably, I would say, like a 9 times out of 10, that's the next thing. And then they're like, I don't know if I want to run a marathon. Maybe I just want to lift weights and run, so it's like, it kind of titrates backwards as they think about like the actual dedication that it takes to do a marathon, which is a lot of miles. But I think that's so natural. All these things like don't freak me out in my mind. Like, when I'm sitting with an athlete, I'm just like, all these things will work out, and they're going to figure it out, and they're going to feel anxiety, and they're going to feel grief, and they're going to feel all these like losses that go with not being in their sport anymore. But eventually there comes a point where like there's some clear thinking, where they like given themselves some time to, de-identify themselves as athlete first. And then they're going to start working on. But I think you've got to just give them that transition time too. And I think that's the part that people worry about. And I think that's where I worry about athletes too, is like, okay, well, what is the transition? How do you keep yourself busy? And that's like I'm like, just keep yourself busy, like do things, meet with people, do the things you haven't been able to do, go on vacations, and help them to transition well. And then start really working on the career side stuff too at the same time, almost like a dual process.
Nice. We're going to take a short break to hear more about the Rocky Mountain Sports Counseling Center, and then Brooke and I'll be right back.
Hello, this is Brooke Ewert, founder and director of the Rocky Mountain Sports Counseling Center. Athletes at all levels struggle with different mental health issues at different times in their sports journeys and careers. Myself and my team of licensed professional counselors at Rocky Mountain Sports Counseling Center stand ready to offer you and your family the help and support that you need. Our team is available for on-site and remote counseling support. Learn more by visiting our website at RockyMountainSportsCounselingCenter.com. You can email or call me or a member of our counseling team. Reach out to us today to get started on a pathway toward recovering and growing your mental health strength and resiliency. Rocky Mountain Sports Counseling Center, supporting athletes as they work through mental health crisis, injury, and retirement.
Okay, so Brooke, maybe break it down really simply for us. What is the difference between a mental performance coach, a sports psych, person, let's call them a person, right? Maybe they have a certificate through some program, a counselor, a therapist, a psychologist. I'm thinking about someone, an athlete or someone else who's new to the subject of seeking mental health. And I don't know, is it right to think that there's layers or levels, or there's AA, AAA? How do we understand mental health in the helping profession? Where would an athlete start, and who or what level might be most helpful based on, I don't know, any given number of things?
Yeah, I think like when I think about all those words and all those titles, like my first thought goes, you have to know what you're seeking. I think that's the first part for me is like, what are you actually seeking to get better at? What do you need support around? I'm going to start with sports counseling first because that's my field. I like really am not as concerned with performance as I am with what's going on behind the scenes. So I have a kiddo right now that's an incredible baseball player, really struggling with getting his pitches in. I am not an expert at pitching. I'm not an expert at how to get the pitches into the right spot and get it in the strike zone. But what I am an expert in is helping him to break down what's going on behind the scenes. He has tons of anxiety. He's got a lot going on. And I think he has a lot of expectations because he's going to the next level. So I am like very interested in like, what does your anxiety look like? Where else is this in your life? Does it breathe? Like, are you overthinking at night before you go to bed? Like, how do we calm him down? There's like all these processes I'm looking at. I don't think he has any other symptoms of any other mental health stuff. Like I don't see him as a kiddo who's depressed. So I'm like trying to really narrow it in. And then I'm like, okay, let's start things really small. And so I go to, there's a a theory called Gestalt, and I'm like very interested in keeping them in the here and now. Let's not think about summer. Let's not think about like next fall when you're pitching. Like let's just stay on today's date at this time, and you've got 24 hours, and let's focus on today. And like slowing him way down. And it's interesting, within 2 sessions, he was like, I'm just slowing things way down. And he thinks that's his idea, which
Yeah.
is fine, it is his idea. And he's like, but he's grasping onto language that I'm talking about in that room. And I was even saying, I think last week I was like, maybe let's hold off on visualization stuff. Like, let's just slow things down. Let's see how you do with slowing things down. So it's like we're almost mirroring language. And then I'm also like, let's not add additional things in. Sports psychologists, from what I understand, to the best of my ability, is they're much more team and like performance focused. The clinical piece is something that I think they're starting to get more training in. And I think they would probably say that's like that they're really good at that. I don't know, like school wise, where that fits in, as much as where I don't feel comfortable is going into a team and being like, hey, this is how we work as a team. And this is how we're going to be the best team ever. That makes me feel very out of my zone very quickly. I will do it if I'm asked to do it, but I don't feel 100% comfortable in that zone.
Sure.
They're also very like concerned about like performance and all the mechanics and like the kinesiology pieces. And they've got a ton of training that I don't have. And that's where I'm like, I'm out of my zone 100%. And so that's why I was saying like the best example I could give is like when someone's like, I'm really struggling with my pitches. I'm like, I don't have like the kinesiology background to be like, oh, it's because your arm isn't slotted this way. And it's like, you're missing it by your wrist action. It's like, there's all these like components that I don't have, and I'm totally fine with that. I don't need to be in that zone ever. And my athletes don't want me there. But where I feel like, maybe this is like going back to sports counseling, I'm really good at family systems and understanding relationships and understanding how to work with their coaches and communicate. Where I think that's where the gray is like, I feel like sports counselors and sports psychologists probably have like, we can work with coaches and help them to, how to work, have the athletes work well with their coach, but probably looking at from two totally different lenses. And then the mental performance, which is so interesting. When you said that first, I was like, my brain like literally does not even know what that is. Like, because I feel like they're probably taking something from both of us and, helping the athlete to get better, but probably don't have the schooling behind it as my first and my first guess. But I'm sure there are some incredible mental performance coaches out there that are incredible at what they do. And I think my thought is we're all literally working for the same goal, which is to help the athlete to get better. I want to try to stay in my zone where I feel like I've been gifted as best as possible. And when I start feeling like I'm tipping out of it, I quickly ask either for help or support for somebody. And I think that's the goal, is like, there's so many of us that are out there now helping athletes. You have to know where that gray zone is, or like even starting to inch towards the other zone where you're not comfortable, and ask for support or help. And I do that with eating disorders. Sometimes like I'll be like, oh man, I'd like, this is like starting to be in an area I don't feel comfortable with. And then I ask one of my teammates who works for Rocky Mountain Sports Counseling Center, like, what do you do in these situations? Or what do I need? Do they need additional support that I don't have, or I don't have the training? So I think it's that. It's like, to me, that's where we all kind of fall in our own spaces.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because my friends across the pond call it signposting, right? Or we call it referrals here, is just making sure or knowing when you've hit a ceiling in the terms of what you're able to care for. And I even go back years ago, when you and I started working together, and working with Cody Baker as well. It was an athlete that had come with an eating disorder, and I know about eating disorders. And I know that I'm not qualified to help with eating disorder. And so I was referring that athlete on to get help with his eating disorder. And you would have been blown away to think, like, these aren't things that we think of as fans. We don't think about the things the pressures that are on for someone, and then maybe the struggles that are tied in. I've shared, as part of all the podcasts for this month, that 1 in 5 adults struggles with some sort of mental illness or form of mental health struggle. And it's just amazing to think of, especially, I wonder if it's more amplified with the elite athletes and the pressures that occur at elite levels of the game. And I think we've seen some of those stories come out more recently. And well, friends, that is where we're going to have to pause the interview for today. Come back next week. We'll finish up with part 2. Brooke and I will play a fun little game, Crosses with Rev. If you're a longtime listener of the pod, you know this little game that we like to play with guests. And we'll talk more about mental health needs during this Mental Health Awareness Month of May. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to seeing you next week.